at 9:17 on the morning of January 22nd, 1943. Second Lieutenant John George crouched in the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. He watched a banyan tree 240 yards away through a scope his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 weeks. At 27 years old, this Illinois state champion had 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. In the past 72 hours, they had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. Other platoon leaders called it his mail-order's sweetheart. When he had first unpacked the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the armor asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. George explained it was for the Japanese. But the regiment shipped out before the rifle even arrived. George spent the voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men clean their M1 Garons, while his own weapon sat in a warehouse back in Illinois. He requested it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December of 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked fragile. Inside was the rifle he had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. The rifle weighed 9 pounds. The scope added another 12 ounces. The Garan, issued to every other man in his battalion, weighed 9.5 pounds with no magnification. Joga's rifle was bolt-action, with 5 rounds. The Garan was semi-automatic. With 8 rounds, Captain Morris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December of 1942. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had taken Henderson Field and held it, but they had not taken Mount Austin, nor had they cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanikaw River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese called it the Give. It was a fortress of 500 men and 47 bunkers. Georgia's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 days. They lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded before they finally took the western slope on January 2nd. By then, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. The jungle around Point Cruz was different. There were no bunkers, no fixed positions, just Japanese soldiers who had retreated west from Henderson Field and dug into the massive trees. Some of those soldiers were snipers. They had scoped Arisaka Type 98s. They knew the jungle. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 more men died. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George explained his credentials. He was the Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards in 1939. At just 23 years old, he was the youngest winner in the state's history. He could shoot 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan scope, he could put 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. If you want to see how George's civilian rifle performed against Japanese snipers trained for jungle warfare, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Bike to George. He spent the night checking his rifle. The Winchester had been packed in cosmoline for the ocean voyage, so he cleaned it again. He checked the scope mounts. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he had packed back in Tennessee, not the standard military ball AMO. The Garan fired at dawn on January 22nd. George moved into position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence, said the Japanese snipers, operated from the large trees in that area, banyan trees. A sniper could climb one of those trees before dawn and sit there all day without being seen. George had brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition and stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began to watch the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan had 2.5 power magnification. Not much, but enough to see movement in the branches that the naked eye would miss. The jungle was never silent. Birds, insects, the distant sound of artillery. George had learned to filter out the noise and focus on movement. He glanced the trees slowly, left to right. Top 2 bottom. At 9:17, he saw it. A branch moved, 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away. Then he saw the shape, a man in dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies. George adjusted his scope. 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, 3.5 pounds. He had spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. Now, he would find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. He dropped through the branches, his body tumbling 90 feet before hitting the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt, the empty cartridge ejected. He chambered another round. He kept his scope on the tree, waiting for movement. Japanese snipers often worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere in that tree or in the trees nearby. George scanned the surrounding banyans. The scope's low magnification forced him to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men. The jungle canopy created shadows that made shapes impossible to distinguish without careful observation. At 9:43, he found the second sniper. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up. He had heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, and fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded his Winchester from a strip of clip. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the target shot back. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt right into his face. Aeroyate left, pressing himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, a different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited a full 3 minutes before moving. He inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees. The shooter would have moved after taking the shot. That was basic sniper doctrine. Shoot and relocate. But in a jungle this dense, relocation options were limited. George found him at 11:38, in the 3rd tree from the left, in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but remained in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The 3rd sniper fell without a sound. By noon, George had taken out 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread like wildfire through the battalion. Men who had mocked his Maylota rifle now timidly asked if they could watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention, and attention drew fire. After the 5th kill, the Japanese snipers adapted. They stopped moving during the day. George spent the rest of the afternoon glassing the trees, seeing nothing but leaves and shadows. At 4 in the afternoon, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with a heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into a river of mud. The trees became invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to break. The downpour stopped at 8:15 in the morning. By 8:45, enough visibility had returned for him to get back to work. He spotted the first sniper of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had smartly used the cover of the rain to climb into position, the sound masking his movement. This sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out, a much longer range than yesterday. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for the distance and fired. The sniper fell. This 6th kill brought a response George hadn't anticipated. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began pounding the area around his bunker. They had triangulated his position, likely from the muzzle flash or the sound of his rifle. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. He knew the third one would be a direct hit. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater just as the third salvo landed. The bunker he had occupied moments before vanished in a cloud of fire, dirt, and flying debris. He had to relocate. He found a new spot, a fallen tree about 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. It provided good cover and a clear view of the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew he was hunting them, and now they were hunting him back. The dynamic had shifted. This was no longer just target shooting. This was a duel. At 2:23 in the afternoon, George killed his 7th sniper. At 3:41, he took down his 8th. This one had climbed high, 94 feet, up a banyan tree. It was good concealment, but the height created a silhouette against the sky as the sun's angle changed. At 5 o'clock, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. He had been in position for 9 hours straight. Maurice wanted the numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired, 8 kills, 4 misses. The captain assigned him to continue sniper operations at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester rifle and considered the math. There had been 11 Japanese snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead, leaving 3. He knew those 3 would be the best of the best, the ones who had survived the longest, and by now, they knew exactly what he looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. He gave up around 3 a.m., sitting in his tent with a rifle across his lap. The rain started again at 4:15, and by 5:30 it was so heavy that dawn operations would have to be delayed. George used the time to move to a new position, not the bunker, not the fallen tree. He had to go somewhere the Japanese would never expect. He chose a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south of his previous spot, a place the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered great cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43 in the morning, the rain slowed to a drizzle and visibility improved. George began glassing the trees. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was in a palm tree 190 yards out, but he was low, only about 40 feet up. This was unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better set. This one had chosen concealment over elevation, using the palm fronds as a natural hide that would be invisible from the ground. But George wasn't at ground level. He was elevated on the rocks, and the angle gave him a view down into the fronds. He could clearly see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, and began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. After hunting these men for 3 days and killing 8 of them, he knew the remaining 3 wouldn't make such an elementary mistake. They wouldn't position themselves where an elevated shooter could easily spot them, unless ... Unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and started scanning the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for the muzzle flash, ready to return fire. George glassed the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. He checked every single tree within 300 yards of that palm. It took him 11 long minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree, 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. This Japanese sniper was in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from 3 sides, and he had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to show up there or to take the shot at the bait in the palm. George now had 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him, the sound would instantly reveal his new position, and the sniper would be gone before George could even work the bolt on his rifle. Second, if he did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and would start searching for him. George made a decision. He would use their bait against them. He aimed back at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for the wind, and fired. The decoy sniper jerked and fell from the palm. Now the real trap was set. The sniper was repositioning to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. He moved east along the rock line and dropped into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34 a.m., Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been positioned just 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted for 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted 260 before moving. He relocated again, this time to a position 100 yards east, a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. George settled into the crater with water up to his chest. He rested his Winchester rifle on the crater rim and resumed glassing the trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He had watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning. A shape moving through the undergrowth, parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using the jungle floor vegetation for cover. Ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered. His breathing was controlled, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot. Rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 9:52 a.m. He had reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through his scope. The sniper was studying the rocks, searching for movement, for any sign of his target. George White. Patience was the primary skill of sniper work. The ability to remain still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment, rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58 a.m., the Japanese sniper began moving again. He crawled forward. 35 yards from the rocks. 30 yards. 20. 5. He was approaching from the south side. At 10:03 a.m., the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the machine gun nest and took up a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. Center mass, 38 yards, an easy shot, even without a scope. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 other snipers, men who had been killed because they made mistakes. This man would not make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. This had to be another decoy, another bait position. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it, somewhere with a line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06 a.m., George found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier was not moving, not repositioning, just watching, waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support. Or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision. He could not shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots. That gave them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13 a.m., the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or find his position. George remained in the water, motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. George rose from the water. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He aimed at the closest soldier, the one who had been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, and swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard a sound that made him freeze. Voices. Japanese voices, coming from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers had not been working alone. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface. He held the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. They were moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George heard branches breaking, equipment rattling. The hunt was far from over. These weren't snipers. They were infantry. A patrol, maybe a recovery team sent to collect the bodies of their fallen comrades. George counted the seconds, his heart a steady drum against his ribs. The voices stopped right where the first body lay, just 42 yards from his crater. They were close enough that he could hear every word clearly, a language he didn't understand but whose meaning was becoming terrifyingly apparent. The voices moved on to the second body. The tones became more urgent, more agitated. Then, at 10:28, they started moving again, but not back towards the tree line. They were coming for him. They'd found his tracks, the sloppy boot prints he'd left in the mud leading from the rocks to his watery hideout. He'd been so careful about noise and movement, but he'd completely forgotten about his tracks. A rookie mistake, and it was about to cost him everything. He had 5 rounds left in the Winchester. He counted at least 6 Japanese soldiers. The odds were terrible for a bolt-action rifle against multiple opponents. His mind raced through the options. Stay hidden and pray. They walk right past him. Or fight. The voices got closer. 30 yards, 20-5. 20. The seconds stretched into an eternity. At 10:31, a shape appeared at the crater's rim, silhouetted against the jungle canopy. A Japanese soldier. He was looking straight down at George, their eyes locked for a fraction of a second. From the murky water, George fired. The soldier crumpled backward, vanishing from sight. Without even thinking, George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambering another round as he pushed himself up out of the water. 2 more soldiers were at the rim, their rifles coming up. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. A fluid, practiced motion. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. Shouting erupted from the jungle. More soldiers were crashing through the undergrowth, heading straight for him, Ayat Tamuba. He scrambled out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices, and ran 20 yards before diving behind a massive fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire exploded around him. Bullets cracked through the air, smacking into the ground around the crater and thudding into the log he used for cover. They were firing blind, just shooting at the sound, at the memory of movement. George stayed low, pressing himself into the dirt. He brought his scope up, glassing the area. He saw movement. 2 soldiers, advancing cautiously towards the crater, about 50 yards out. George settled the crosshairs on the lead soldier. He squeezed the trigger. The man dropped instantly. The second soldier dove for cover, disappearing into the jungle floor. 2 rounds left. Then he heard it dot more voices, but this time they were behind him. They were flanking him. One group was coming from the south, another from the east. He was about to be completely surrounded. He knew he couldn't win this fight. Not with a bolt-action rifle and 2 bullets against a squad of soldiers, likely armed with semi. He had to break contact. He had to get back to American lines. George grabbed his Winchester and ran. He sprinted north, deeper into the jungle. Vines snagged at his boots, and whip-like branches lashed his face. The sound of rifle fire chased him, bullets snapping past his head, striking trees with angry pops. He ran for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 90 seconds before he spotted another shell crater and dove in. This one was dry. He pressed his back against the cool earth of the crater wall and just listened. The shouting was distant now. They hadn't followed. They were regrouping, tending to their dead. George took a moment to check his rifle. It was caked in mud, and water was still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left, and his spare ammunition, the strip of clips, were in his pack. His pack, which was lying somewhere back near the first crater. At 10:47, he began moving again, not running this time, but walking, staying low, using every dip and rise in the terrain for cover. He moved northeast, trying to orient himself toward the American lines. The jungle was eerily quiet now. No voices, no movement, just the sound of his own ragged breathing and the distant, constant rumble of artillery. At 11:13, he finally reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry, half hidden in the foliage, challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry led him through the wire. George walked straight to battalion headquarters to report to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. George gave it to him, sparse and professional. 11 Japanese snipers eliminated over 4 days. 12 rounds fired to do it. 11 hits. Then, the firefight with the infantry patrol. 3 more confirmed kills in that engagement, using 5 rounds. Maurice asked about his ammunition status. George told him he was down to his last 2 rounds. Maurice looked at the rifle. It was a mess. George confirmed it was functional but needed a thorough cleaning. Mud in the action, water still in the barrel. Maurice told him to get some rest. There would be no operations for him tomorrow. The battalion was moving east anyway. The groves, where he'd been hunting, were no longer a priority. Intelligence suggested the Japanese were finally evacuating Guadalcanal, and the withdrawal would be complete within 2 weeks. George went back to his tent. He field-stripped the Winchester and spent the next 2 hours meticulously cleaning every single component. He used cosmoline and gun oil, running patch after patch through the barrel until they came out perfectly clean. He checked the scope mounts, adjusted the eye relief, and loaded 5 fresh rounds from a new box. At 1400 hours, word came down. The battalion commander wanted to see him. As George walked to the headquarters tent, he couldn't help but wonder if this was it. Was Maurice filing a negative report? Unauthorized engagement. Operating alone. Wasting ammunition. He was bracing for the worst. Instead, he found Captain Maurice waiting with 2 other officers. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. The colonel got straight to the point. He had just one question for George. Could he train other men to do what he had just done? George considered it. He said he could try, but it wouldn't be easy. It would take time, specialized rifles with scopes, and most importantly, men who were already excellent shots. Colonel Ferry smiled. He said the division had 14 Springfield rifles fitted with unertl scopes, sniper rifles the Marines had left behind, and in his regiment, he had 40 men who had qualified as expert marksmen before they even deployed. Ferry's plan was clear. He wanted George to create a sniper section from scratch, train the men, develop the tactics, and clear out any remaining Japanese snipers from their operational areas. George accepted, but on one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. The rifle had become an extension of himself. Colonel Ferry approved the request without hesitation. The Winchester Model 70 would remain his personal weapon. The 14 Springfield rifles would go to the men he was about to train. Training began on January 27th. George had 40 men assembled at a makeshift range a couple of miles east of Henderson Field. On paper, they were all expert marksmen, capable of hitting targets at 500 yards with iron sights, but none of them had ever been a combat sniper. None of them had ever taken a life from a concealed position. George started with the absolute fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, how to read the wind. The Springfield rifles were beasts, weighing 11 pounds with the unertl scopes attached. They were much heavier than the standard M1 Garand, even heavier than George's Winchester. That weight made them stable, but it was exhausting to hold them steady for long periods. He taught them to use anything and everything for support trucks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered a perfect, comfortable shooting position. A sniper had to adapt, to build a stable platform from whatever was available. The range training lasted for 3 intense days. George had them shooting at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards. Then they moved on to moving targets, and finally, 2 targets that were partially hidden by jungle vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the original 40 men could consistently hit a man-sized target at 300 yards under simulated field conditions. It was a start. George divided these 32 men into 16 two-man teams, each with a shooter and a spotter. The spotter would carry binoculars and an M1 Garand. His job was to find the targets and provide security while the shooter took the shot. After a kill, they could switch roles. This strategy kept both men sharp and avoided the risk of relying on a single shooter. On February 1st, George took the first 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear any remaining Japanese positions west of the Mataniko River. Intelligence reported small groups of stragglers, regular infantry who hadn't evacuated yet. The 4 teams moved out at dawn and set up their positions. George paired himself with a spotter, a young corporal named Hayes. They found a piece of high ground overlooking a trail that the Japanese had been using. They settled in and waited. At 0720, a lone Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through his binoculars. A simple nod. George took a breath, let it out, and fired. The story of the Army's first Pacific snipers had just begun. During his 3 months in Burma, George had a realization. The Winchester Model 70 was a phenomenal rifle, maybe the best bolt-action sporting rifle ever made. But modern warfare was changing fast. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming the new standard. The next war would demand different weapons, different tactics. But there wouldn't be a next war for George, at least not right away. By June of 1944, he and the rest of the Marauders were evacuated from Burma. The unit was disbanded. George was sent back to the United States for training duties. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. George arrived back in the States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and stationed him at Fort Benning, Georgia. His new job was training infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He passed on the hard-won lessons from Guadalcanal in Burma: how to navigate dense jungle, how to spot and engage targets from a distance, and how to operate independently, far from supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. That rifle had been on an incredible journey from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, Burma, and finally Georgia. It had taken down at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, and probably more. George had stopped keeping count after Burma. The rifle now sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. He rarely even looked at it. The war had shifted. American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific, advancing through France and toward Germany. The need for individual marksmen with their own rifles was fading. The military was all about standardization, mass production, interchangeable parts, soldiers with identical gear and training. George understood why. Modern war was an industrial-scale operation. But he felt something important was being lost. The individual skill, that craftsman's approach to soldiering. The idea that one man, with the right rifle and the right training, could single-handedly change the course of a battle. George was honorably discharged from the Army in January of 1947. He left as a lieutenant colonel, decorated with 2 bronze stars, a Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantryman badge. He returned to his home state of Illinois and, using the GI Bill, enrolled at Princeton University. He studied politics, graduating with highest honors in 1950. His academic journey didn't stop there. After Princeton, George spent 4 years at Oxford, followed by 4 more years in British East Africa, studying regional politics. He eventually settled down in Washington, D.C., becoming the executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. Throughout all those years, George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma. His colleagues knew he'd served in the Pacific, but they didn't know the details. They didn't know about Point Cruz. They didn't know about the Japanese snipers, or about the Winchester Model 70 that sat quietly in a case in his home. Then, in 1947, George decided to write it all down. Not for publication, but for his own records. He wanted to document the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare while the details were still fresh in his mind. He wrote for 6 months, and the manuscript ballooned to over 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and strongly suggested he get it published. George was hesitant. The book was highly technical, filled with detailed descriptions of rifles, ammunition, and ballistics. He didn't think it would interest the general public, but the NRA convinced him. The book was published in 1947 with the title Shots Fired in Anger. It quickly became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. The book detailed George's experiences on Guadalcanal and in Burma. With clinical precision, there was no embellishment. No hero worship, just cold, hard facts and observations about what worked and what didn't. In combat, the book is still in print today, used as a key reference by collectors and historians studying World War II small arms. In fact, George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed contemporary accounts ever written. George lived long enough to see the United States fight in 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He watched military rifles evolve from the Garand to the M14 and then to the M16. He watched as sniping became a formal military specialty, with its own dedicated training schools and equipment. He saw the lessons of World War II being relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers. John George passed away on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. His legendary Winchester Model 70, the rifle that outshot Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal, was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Today, it sits in a display case, with a small placard describing its history. Most visitors walk right past without giving it a second glance. It just looks like any other vintage hunting rifle. But it's not. That is the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a mail-order scope could defeat professionally trained military snipers. That is the rifle that cleared the groves of Point Cruz in 4 days, when an entire battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. It's the rifle that fundamentally changed how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories like this from dusty archives every single day. Stories about incredible riflemen who proved themselves with skill and courage. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches all across the globe. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure John George doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt on his rifle and scanned for more targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail. 7 shots resulted in 6 kills. 1 miss was chalked up to a sudden gust of wind. The other 3 sniper teams reported similar results. In total, 23 Japanese soldiers were killed that day, with 0 American casualties. This was the brutal, effective reality of sniper operations on Guadalcanal. The sniper section continued their work through early February. By February 9th, they had amassed 74 confirmed kills. This number was conservative, only counting kills where the body could be physically observed. During this same period, the Japanese evacuation from the island accelerated. Destroyers crept in under the cover of darkness, picking up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to cut off the evacuation, but the Japanese fought incredibly effective rearguard actions to protect their retreating comrades. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating these Japanese soldiers who were covering the retreat routes. It was on February 7th, while operating near the Tanambago River, that George's luck seemed to run out. A Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck him squarely in the left shoulder. The impact was violent, spinning him around and knocking him to the ground. His comrade, Hayes, immediately dragged him to cover and screamed for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but thankfully, not fatal. The bullet had passed clean through muscle, miraculously missing bone and major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors there cleaned and sutured the wound, telling him he'd make a full recovery but needed rest. That meant no combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks recovering at the field hospital. During that time, the Japanese successfully completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces finally reached Cape Esperance, only to find it deserted. The long, bloody campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for a mere 12 days, but in that time, they had racked up 74 confirmed kills with 0 friendly casualties during their specific operations. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters, and Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war was far from finished. While he was still recovering, new orders came down from Pacific Command. The Army was looking for experienced combat officers for a new, top-secret mission, something in Burma. Without hesitation, George volunteered. By March, he was on a transport ship, heading west across the Pacific. His prized Winchester Model 70 rifle was packed securely in a waterproof case down in the cargo hold, its Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped carefully in oilcloth. George knew nothing about the details of the Burma mission, only that it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, and operating deep behind Japanese lines. It was exactly the kind of mission where a man with a rifle that could hit targets at 600 yards might prove exceptionally useful. The transport ship reached India on April 3rd. There, George and 200 other officers were finally briefed on their assignment. They were to join a new unit, 3,000 men in total. The unit didn't even have an official designation yet, but the men had already come up with their own name for it. They were drilled in long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, and how to operate for extended periods without traditional supply lines. The entire concept was modeled after the British Chindits. Small, mobile forces designed to wreak havoc deep behind enemy lines. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His official role wasn't sniper, as the Army didn't have formal sniper positions in its structure at the time. He was designated as a rifle platoon leader. But word of his skill had followed him from Guadalcanal. Colonel Ferris's recommendation had made its way to battalion command. They knew exactly what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal, but the core challenges were the same. Suffocating heat, IG humidity, dense vegetation, and severely limited visibility. And they all knew the Burma jungle would be even worse, with steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, and an enemy who knew the ground intimately. George knew he had to adapt his equipment, involving patrols lasting for weeks, covering hundreds of miles through unforgiving jungle. Every single ounce of weight mattered. George made a tough decision. The Marauders entered Burma in February of 1944. Their mission was to advance through the northern part of the country and capture the vital Myitkyina airfield. This airfield was critical for Allied supply routes into China. The Japanese controlled the area with an estimated 4,000 troops and considered the approach route impassable for any large force. It was a hellscape of mountains, rivers, and dense jungle, with no roads and only limited trails. The Marauders would carry all their supplies on their own backs or with pack mules. They had no motorized transport, no artillery support, just rifles, mortar, and the ability to move with speed through impossible terrain. George's battalion began their march on February 24th. The first week alone covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Cases of malaria skyrocketed daily. The pack mules struggled, and several had to be shot after breaking their legs on treacherous descents. By March, the battalion had covered an astonishing 217 miles and had engaged Japanese forces a dozen times. These were small skirmishes, ambushes, and quick firefights, followed by a rapid withdrawal. The Marauders weren't meant to take and hold ground. They were ghosts, meant to move harass, cut supply lines, and create chaos deep behind the Japanese front. During this grueling march, George used his Winchester only 3 times. Once, at 412 yards, to take out a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. And once, at 290 yards, to eliminate a sniper who had pinned down another Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. George had developed a strict discipline. He never fired more than once per engagement. The report of his Winchester was distinctive, different from the sharp crack of the standard M1 Guerrilla. One shot announced his presence, but a second shot would give the enemy precious time to pinpoint his location. He learned to shoot and then immediately move. The march to Myitkyina took 3 agonizing months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 miles of the world's most difficult terrain. They had lost more men to disease than to combat. Malaria, dysentery, and typhus ravaged their ranks. The unit that had entered Burma with 3,000 men was now down to fewer than 1,300 effective soldiers. The operation was a stunning success, but the cost had been immense. George survived the Burma campaign. Most of the combat was vicious. Close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less. Desperate firefights in dense vegetation where you could barely see 30 feet in front of you. A different battlefield, a different war, and a testament to the incredible resilience of the soldiers who fought it.